So in this video, I'm going to give you some tips and coaching and maybe even some warnings. This is an optional video, but it can definitely help you improve your response or submit something better than you might if you did not watch this video. So I've come up with three examples, three possible responses using two possible part ones. So as you know, you have to copy and paste something you wrote earlier in the semester for part one of the task you are currently working on. I'm using a different topic as my example. So this is not about the item 3 mandatory writing assignment topic. Hence, you don't see any arguments or discussion of, COVID-19 vaccines and having to drive through protesters. Instead, you see, a paragraph here that our pretend student wrote earlier in the semester about whether they reflected intellectual humility just as they were about to start a soft talk module on argument analysis. So just keep that in mind. This is a different topic that I'm using to exemplify the gist of what it looks like to show or discuss what it might look like for someone else to evaluate something that you wrote earlier in the semester. So that's the main point of this. So here we have our sample response then, and then here we have the student discussing how Dr. C might evaluate what they wrote earlier in the semester. So let's go ahead and look at this. So in yellow, I do have highlighted phrases that show you and emphasize what it reads like and hence what it would sound like to talk about how someone else is going to evaluate your response. So one thing to keep in mind is that how often you see reference to Dr. C or that other person. In your response, you're going to constantly refer to Bentham and how Bentham might evaluate something that you wrote earlier in the semester. Now, in order for someone to evaluate what you said, to make some kind of general comments about your response being satisfactory, unsatisfactory, having a weakness or strengths, being good or bad, compelling or not compelling, the evaluator, this other person, in your case Bentham would be have to first analyze. So that's what you see a lot in this response. So the overall evaluation that the student thinks Dr. Carrillo would make about this up here is that is down here. Notice what this says. Given all I have presented thus far, I am led to believe that Dr. Carrillo would say my argument is far from satisfactory. So the evaluative term is right here, right? But how did the student who wrote this come to this conclusion that someone else, i.e. Dr. Carrillo, would form this general evaluative claim, make this judgment based on some criteria that Dr. Carrillo has in mind? Well, to get to this, it's not just enough to say, oh, Dr. Carrillo would say I did a satisfactory job, unsatisfactory job, a good job, a bad job. She might have a mixed reaction, saying some parts are good, some parts are bad. The student who wrote this had to break down what it is that Dr. Carrillo might say, leading her and hence the student to see that she might say that the argument is far from satisfactory. Now, notice, I'm just going to read through this and make comments, and I could make separate videos for each of the examples, and that would certainly make the videos shorter. But that takes a lot more work because then I have to upload 3 videos, tag them, and do all this other work in YouTube to do so. So what I recommend is that you follow me through one example and then take a break, and then follow me through another example and take a break. I recommend that you follow me at least through this example and then at least through, I'm trying to think, maybe this example right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and look through this example. So again, in yellow, pay attention. I'm going to be looking for the kind of phrases that I have here in yellow. I'm going to be looking for that. A lot of these kinds of phrases in your response when you're telling me how Bentham might take apart what you said. and evaluate something. So let's look at this. If Dr. C were to look at my argument copied above in italics, I think she would focus on the support I offer for my conclusion that I strongly reflected intellectual humility just as I was about to start the soft talk module on argument analysis. So this student is, setting up what their focus is going to be, and that is on what Dr. C might say about the support offered for the conclusion. And then to give some detail, the student self-quotes from their original response. Really strong responses will have at least one self-quote in the paragraph where they're discussing how Bentham might evaluate a given response. Then next, again, we say she might begin. So you're using intellectual empathy to imaginatively put yourself in the mindset, the attitude, the theory, the thinking of someone else. So this is where the video lectures that I did for this task come into play. Those video lectures really help you to get into the mindset and thinking, and hence the terminology used to name the concepts in the thinking for Bentham. So make sure that you're using the lectures that came before this part of this task. So she might begin. So we're imagining how she might start her critique. And I might have put critique in turquoise as well, because even though there's no evaluative claim being made, we know that the student is focused on how Dr. C might evaluate, right? And of course, when we evaluate and critique, that means that we can bring up both pros and cons, positives and negatives, strengths or weaknesses. Sometimes when people hear the word or read the word critique, they think only of cons, negatives, and weaknesses. But critiques can also include pros and strengths, right? So her critique with her own theory about intellectual virtue. So whose theory will you be discussing in this task? Not mine, and definitely not about intellectual virtue. It'll be Bentham's theory about what? What is the name of his theory? You should name his theory, and of course you want to directly name him as well. I should see Bentham, in your paragraph at least once, at least at the beginning, and then maybe again at the end or throughout the paragraph. And definitely you want to, at the beginning, mention the name of his theory. To be specific, I think she might start by offering her own definition for intellectual virtue. Remember what I said earlier in the semester, that when you see a word in quotation marks, that means that we're not using it, that we're mentioning the word, and then you can see that the student includes a quote from something that either Dr. C said herself. It could be something in your response. You should include a quote from something that I said in the lecture about Bentham. So, you might say something about, like, according to the lecture that Dr. C said gave with respect to Bentham, he endorses the following principle of utility, and then you can quote what I said as a really good version of his principle of utility. And of course, you would tell me, here I have the internal citation. You would give as an internal citation video number 1 or video number 2. I do give you written information about the internal citation you should use to cite from the video lectures that I did for this task. And I did 2, which you should have already reviewed at this part very thoroughly and have lots of notes for. As such, I think one thing she might point out is that I failed to make explicit in my reasoning the definition I had in mind for intellectual humility. She might then move on to use her own definition for the concept to argue that the ideas expressed in my premises do not do anything to support my conclusion. And I meant to include, guys, in this example that Dr. C might say that the student seems more focused on something that Dr. C would call intellectual perseverance in their reasoning. If you look at the wording here, you could pause the video and look at the wording. It seems like the student is focused more on how hard they worked to understand and work through something, right? Versus whether or not they were open-minded and were aware of the limits of their own knowledge. But I didn't do that, but that's not, I didn't have to do that. I'm just saying I thought I might do that, and I didn't. So then the student goes on to say, she might point out that while it is interesting or notable that I do work really hard to understand what I'm learning, no matter how difficult or how much effort might be required, self-quotes, these ideas expressed in my argument lack the proper focus in deciding whether one has reflected intellectual humility, meaning I lack the proper focus in the support I give for my conclusion. So this is where I was thinking I could have said, she might even say that I focused on something called intellectual perseverance in my reasoning and not intellectual humility. Notice that I put self-quotes to indicate to the reader of this discussion that what is now in quotation marks is not something that is original to Dr. Carrillo, but that what I have in quotation marks here is something that is original to the student. So the student as the speaker is making sure the reader understands that what is in quotes here that I have underlined for you to see more easily is the student self-quoting from where? From the paragraph. Any self-quoting you do for this task needs to come from your original response from item 3 for the mandatory writing assignment. So now you can see the student has a mixture of self-quotes here, right? And Dr. C quotes, the quotes from the other who's the student is saying would evaluate their response in some way. So student quote, quote from someone else who's evaluating, and the student is imagining is evaluating the work. And then we have some more self-quote here. And the student is really trying to tease out connections between the quote from the other, the person that is evaluating and hence analyzing their response, and what they actually said or did not say in their response. Now, this shows you how you can have an in-depth discussion when you fail to make mention or make something explicit. And that is certainly a critique you can bring to light. You can say, Bentham might critique me or say that a weakness that I have is that I didn't make something explicit. But of course, if you didn't make something explicit, then there's nothing to quote about that, right? But what you can do is you can do what is done here. You can say, well, Bentham might say that I focused on A, B, and C, as noted in this self-quote, colon, or something like that. And then what might Bentham say about the fact that you focused on that rather than something else? To add to this, she might point out that I never make explicit mention of concepts she emphasizes with the word knowledge, much less, again, using her words, admitting that there are limits to my own knowledge. Okay, so here we have, what are we seeing here? She might point out that I never make explicit mention of concepts she emphasizes with the word knowledge. So notice how I'm being careful to set up the reader's understanding that when I quote the word knowledge, I say she emphasizes with the word knowledge, right? And so the student who's writing this, right, the writer, is making sure that we understand that this quote is from something Dr. C said, and of course that's from the quoted material up here. Much less, again, using her words. So again, the student who is discussing this is making sure that we know that the quoted words are those originally taken from original thinking from Dr. C as manifested in here, admitting that there are limits to my knowledge. That said, she might acknowledge, so these would all be like weaknesses, right? And you could even write a sentence like the following point to a weakness she might see, or you could even put that down here. So all of this points to a weakness or some weaknesses. And then you could say, so here I have that said, she might acknowledge, in other words, she might see that I have a strength, or she might say that there is something plausible or good about my response. So she might acknowledge that when I talk about working hard to understand whatever I'm learning, so you see again the student is self-quoting. They say that right here. They say, when I talk about, that's how I know from whom these quotes are coming. I do appear to show implicit attention to knowledge. So that's fine, and some students would stop here, but you need to tease out the connections that you have in mind. Always make the implicit explicit, as I say. So the student's saying, and then so they give a reason, because typically knowledge is a goal of learning something. So remember the student said something about learning, right? They said up here, they said, I think I work really hard to understand what I'm learning. So that's where they self-quote from there, and then they say, hey, Dr. C might focus on what I said there and say that I give implicit attention to knowledge, but then why? Again, why might she say that? Because typically knowledge is a goal of learning something. So in your critique or your evaluation from the perspective of Bentham with respect to your original response, you could focus on as a positive, a pro, or a strength, that the philosopher might say that you show implicit attention to something, but then you have to argue for that claim. Or that you show explicit attention to something, but then again, you have to provide evidence, argue for that claim. Then the student goes on to say Nevertheless, I think she would still say that I failed to show sufficient explicit attention to important aspects of being intellectually humble. I should have a closing quotation mark right there, as she defines the concept. And I might have put I fail there in turquoise because that's an evaluative term. And so then we get here to like this kind of summary conclusion where the student says, here's what I think the overall evaluation is going to be. All right, so I suggest you take a break because this is a lot to digest. Otherwise, you can resume or continue with the second example. Before you hear what I have to say about this second example, and I should have reminded you or iterated this with respect to the first example, you should definitely first read through the student's self-quote of an original response that this pretend student wrote earlier in the semester, because if you don't already know what the student said, then trying to follow me through my explanation of what this is doing, right, is going to make less sense. So before we continue, make sure that you read this and then follow what I have to say. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this second example. So after reviewing Dr. C's lessons on intellectual humility, I have concluded that Dr. C would say, my second paragraph shows good attention to an important element of being intellectually humble. Okay, so here they start off with an evaluative claim, right? We see that they're focused, that they are properly in the position of Dr. C's mindset and what she might say, and that they start off with a general claim that she might make. Now they have to break it down. They have to offer support for what they think Dr. C would say with respect to what's in turquoise. So we then see an analysis with one or two more evaluative references. She might cite, for example, so when you're doing this kind of task, you don't have to go through every single line in your argument or your original response. You can choose one or two things to focus on, and that is much better. If you focus on more than two things, maybe even three things, you're not going to have an in-depth discussion. So it's better to focus on one or two things that you can really get in depth about and get into a lot of details about and provide a lot of support for. If you just give me a list of she would agree with this, she would not agree with this, then you're not going to get a very good grade on this. All right, so continuing on. So here we see that the student has found something to focus on, because look at how long this is, right? You could write 5 pages just on how Dr. C might evaluate this response, or at least 3, if not a page and a half page for each of these paragraphs. Instead, the student decides they're going to focus on a particular paragraph. They say, she might cite, for example, when I said, in addition to being aware that I would be learning from a different teacher about arguments, I was also aware that I would be learning about arguments from the perspective of a different discipline. There I should have the word a. I wish I had said right here, or that the student had said, so again, we're pretending that this is a student discussion of their own work through the lens of Dr. C. I think it would have been better for our imaginary student to say, when I said in my first paragraph. That would have been more precise and directed the attention of the reader to what they're talking about with respect to their original response. So they're quoting from this paragraph right here. Okay, she would say that this, and by this they are referring back to the self-quote, aligns with what she said in a written lecture about the intellectually humble person. So they don't stop there. So then if you stop there, then I'm going to be saying, well, what did she say? What did she say about the intellectually humble person? That's not enough. So accordingly, the student does the correct thing and fleshes out and tells the reader what it is they're thinking about from the lecture. And that is that such a person, quoting from the lecture, remains open to the idea that one can learn from a variety of sources across a variety of contexts. Okay, so then you have the internal citation. All right, so here what they're doing is they're linking something that they said in their original response, a self-quote, to something that the evaluator, right, Dr. Carrillo, has said to talk about how the evaluator, Dr. C, might respond to something that the student said. She might say that I do not explicitly use the words variety of sources and variety of contexts, but I do imply in my statement that I can learn from a variety of sources and contexts. So when they're saying, I do not explicitly use these words in bold, the example here does not do as good a job. The student here is quoting from what? Is pulling out words that name important ideas or refer to important ideas from Dr. Grillo. So really what the student could have said is, she might say that I do not explicitly use, in her own words, the following, : variety of sources and variety of contexts, period. Or comma, no, not comma. That said, she might point out that I do imply. So this could actually be tweaked just a bit to make it even better. That said, notice that they're still talking about what? This quote and how Dr. Carrillo might respond to it and interpret it. Notice how much time is spent discussing that quote. So there's this one statement. So what I've quoted is a statement from a paragraph. And so far we have 2 statements that are discussing how Dr. C might respond to that quote from my response. Okay, I think she would like, and notice that they pay attention to how she might say that words are not used explicitly, right? But that something is implied. So again, you can focus on, something that Bentham would say is implied and therefore a pro, something that's explicit, therefore definitely praiseworthy. You can also say that because something isn't explicit, to that extent there's a weakness. But if you imply something that is not mentioned explicitly, that might be a kind of pro. So to go on, I think she would likewise commend me for talking about in the same paragraph how no discipline has all the knowledge there is to have about anything. So, oh, wait a minute. Now in this one, I think I said it was from the first paragraph, but it's actually in the second paragraph, is it? Let's see. Okay, so actually I had said that this was in the first paragraph, but it's in the second paragraph. The reason why I got confused is because I flipped the order of these 2 examples, and this one actually pulls from the first paragraph. So this example is actually pulling from the second paragraph. This quote right here comes from the second paragraph. So notice that this is an acceptable response. They don't talk about what they say in the first or third paragraph at all. And even though you guys might have only 1 paragraph, if you can do a lot with one self-quote, okay, or one section of your response, then that's just fine. Just be sure that you don't distort or leave the context out of something that you decide to focus on in your response. Okay, so that said, we have, I think she would likewise commend me for talking about in that same paragraph how no discipline has all the knowledge there is to have about anything. So what's really cool here is that the student is paraphrasing something that they say or what their second paragraph is about. She would very much approve, in other words, here's a strength. So they could have said instead, she would say the following is a strength, or she could say it was a strength of my response is that I call attention to, but the wording in this example is she would very much approve of my calling attention to, in my third paragraph, how I remained open-minded about the learning before me. So we know that this quote is not from the professor or Dr. C, but that it's from the student himself or herself because of the introduction to the self-quote. Approve of my calling attention to, in my third paragraph, so all of this tells me that they're about to self-quote. Now, it's not enough to say she would approve of what I said. You can't just say something like that and expect me to infer what the connection is or what this is supposed to show. You have to tell me what this shows me, is supposed to show me, or what you have in mind. Make the implicit explicit. Therefore, this next sentence is vital. As you can see in this self-quote, I explicitly name 2 fundamental and powerful concepts that she also uses. Those words being remain, Dr. C, so you can see that they're being explicit about who uses this particular version of this word for this concept, and remained, when they say me, as well as open. So Dr. C uses that word to name a concept that the speaker also seems to reference with the word open-minded. So they say me. A critique. Okay, so they've been focusing on strengths. So things that are implicit in their quote in that second paragraph, things that are explicit. Of course, if something's explicitly named or referenced or used Bentham is going to say that that is a strength. If something's implicit, that's good, but probably Bentham would say that calling explicit attention to something is a greater strength than making something implicit or giving implicit attention to something. But that said, an implicit attention to something that he thinks is important in reasoning to a moral judgment is still going to be a strength. It's kind of both a strength and a weakness, because you could have made something explicit, but you left it implicit, but at least you left attention to something implicit, or at least you have something implicit, even though it's not explicit. A critique she might make is that I did not make explicit what definition I had in mind for arguing that my conclusion that, then they do another self-quote, and we know it's a self-quote because they say, I had in mind when arguing for my conclusion that, and I should have a comma here, she might say it is very, now why? Why might she say, what's the significance of this? Why would she say that this is, why would she say this is a negative or a con? Why would she find this problematic? So we're elaborating after that, right? So here's a weakness that she might point out. Why is that significant? Let's elaborate on this. She might say it's very important to define fundamental and powerful concepts we are using in our reasonings for our conclusions. Okay, so that's a lot. If you have not taken a break yet, I recommend that you take a break and then resume this video when you're ready. If not, we're going to continue on with this example. You're probably going to hear about 10 seconds of silence. Okay, so our last example. Let's get into it. So I decided that it would be good to do 2 examples for one original response, just to drive home the point that it is possible to focus on, you get to choose what you focus on in your original response, 1 or 2 items, but that is up to you. And it's possible that there are many different acceptable responses that you come up with in terms of how you imagine Bentham would analyze and evaluate what you said with respect to the protesters and delivery of COVID-19 scenario. So here's another good response to such a prompt. Let me go up a little bit. To begin, Dr. C might praise me for the extensive details I provide about my prior argument, learning, and experiences. Okay, so as it turns out, and as you might remember, it is in the first paragraph where the student focuses on what they had already learned about with respect to argument and their experiences with argument, and what they were aware of just as they were about to start the argument module on argument analysis. So I think so again, notice that the student is focusing on something specific. They decided to find something very specific to focus on in their response. And that is something that the topic of the first paragraph. I think she would say that this was important information to include given her definition for intellectual humility, which is being conscious of and readily admitting the limits of one's own knowledge. So here you see a little internal citation. You might decide that you want to quote Bentham's principle of utility or a lecture point that I made about something that he thinks. Then the student, our imaginary student, goes on to say, I think she might argue that the details I provide about my prior argument, learning, and experiences make my following claim more compelling. Even with all my prior argument, learning, and experiences, I did not assume before starting the lesson that I knew all there was to know about arguments. So notice here they're kind of paraphrasing here what is in paragraph 1, and they only cite one statement, right? So remember how I'm using statement is very different from how you use it in everyday life. When I say statement, I am in no way responding to an entire paragraph, but to components that you see in a paragraph. So make sure that you use statement in the same way. So don't use statement to refer to your entire paragraph or your argument. Your argument is comprised of statements. And at most, you should be quoting substantial components in a meaningful way of a statement, or at most one statement. Just remember that at least half of your response, half of your discussion needs to be explanatory, shedding light on something, teasing out connections. She might go on to iterate that though I had not yet learned about her definition at the time I constructed the arguments in italics, my reason, my point implies attention. So here again we're focusing on what the student implies according to Dr. C, what she might say is implied. attention to at least 3 fundamental and powerful concepts in her definition for intellectual humility. As such, I think she commends me. Here, really, the student should say, I think she would commend me for showing at the very least, I think I already said that. Implicit attention to the fact that wait a minute, I lost track of where I'm at. My point implies, okay, yeah. As such, I think she would say she commends me. Okay, so that's fine, actually, for showing at least implicit attention. So again, the students aren't focusing on what, Dr. C might find implicit in their thinking. Attention to the fact that I was, again, in her words, I'm letting the reader know whose words I'm presenting in quotes, conscious of my own knowledge and its limits. So the student never uses these words, and what they're doing is they're saying these words name concepts that the speaker has in mind about intellectual humility. So you can do something like this with Bentham. You can pull from words that I gave you in the lecture points, words that name fundamental and powerful concepts in his thinking. The student never uses the word conscious knowledge and limits, but according to the student, Dr. C might say that he shows implicit attention to concepts named by these words that are found within her definition for being intellectually humble. And notice also that, notice this line right here, she might go on to iterate that though I had not learned about her definition at the time. So you could make a similar move and say, even though I didn't know about Bentham's theory at the time, I think that he would say that I do show attention to things that he thinks are important in his theory. Of course, I didn't expect you to know about Bentham or utilitarianism at the time when I had you write your item 3 response. I wanted your original thinking as much as possible. But still, it's possible that you said something implicitly or explicitly that very much aligns with what Bentham thinks. And anything you can find like that in your response is going to be something that Bentham praises you for. All right, so she might go on to comment that while I do make explicit reference to being conscious of any limits, I do not make, again, the students focus using this term of the terminology of implicit, explicit to being conscious of any limits. So notice that I put these words in italics. I just did that for emphasis because these are words that name fundamental and powerful concepts in Dr. C's thinking, but now I'm actually using the words, so I don't have them in quotation marks. I do give explicit attention to knowledge, the concept of knowledge. So I don't have this in quotation marks because now I'm using the word, as evidenced by my use of knew and know. So the students citing word-based evidence from their self-quote. So they got that from here, right? Knew and know. So why is he justified in claiming that he shows explicit attention to concepts that she thinks are important? The concept of knowledge? Yeah, because he uses the word knew and know here, right, in his own self-quote, which is right here, as does Dr. C. She uses the word knowledge right here. And really what I should have done is what the student, I say I should have done, but I should be saying the student, so I'm pretending to be a student. Really what the student should have done was after here, they should have said, as evidenced by my use of knew and know, and then they could have put in parentheses as knew and know, and as evidenced by her use. So I could have taken out this period and said, and as evidenced by Dr. C's use of, and then quotation marks, knowledge in her definition for intellectual virtue. Or I could have said, as evidenced by my use of knew and know, and then as evidenced by her use of quotation marks, knowledge, period. Okay, so the main problem and hence a weakness, okay, so here that means that here they've been focusing on positives, right, on strengths. And we already knew that he was focusing on praise, right, on praise for the extensive details I give. So now they're going to get into a weakness. She would point out is that I failed, so again, so this is the same critique that I have up here, so I'm not going to repeat the lecture on it. Okay, I hope this helps you think about how you can write your response.